So at this point, I want to discuss two very important concepts. Number one, I want to talk about what happens in the background when you pull up a web page in your browser. And number two, I want to talk about how Ruby on Rails actually produces web pages for us. Okay, so let's talk about the first part. If you recall the client-server relationship, that's just a way of thinking about how computers communicate with each other, right? So our computers, our personal computers, and the browsers that are on them send out a request into the internet whenever we want to go to a specific web page. Okay, so if I go to google.com here in my browser, okay, or if I go to facebook.com in another browser window here, the browser sends out what we call an HTTP request, and it sends it out into the internet. And remember, the internet is just all of the interconnected computers across the world. So computers in other people's homes, computers in office buildings, and computers in data centers or warehouses all over the world. Anyone that's connected together through cables or through radio waves, as we call wireless communication, that's all part of the internet. Now, an HTTP request looks something like this. It's almost like a digital text message, but the only reason we call it an HTTP request is because it follows a specific format. You can't just send out a request like hello from the browser or hey, I want the Facebook homepage. The browser won't just send out text like that to get those pages. Instead, it sends it out in a more organized way, and that's what's called HTTP. It follows a certain set of rules. So that request gets sent out into the internet, and it looks for another computer at that particular address that you requested. So for example, facebook.com is just a domain name, and it actually translates into some kind of a numerical address. And so when you want to go to facebook.com, the computer sends the HTTP request out to find a computer somewhere out in the world that has a particular unique address. And that's what we call an IP address. Once it finds that computer catches that request and processes it, and then sends back an HTTP response. And the response looks something like this. Again, it's just like a digital text message, and it's got some header information, and then in the body of it, it's got the HTML, and that's how you get this logo here and these images and buttons and things like that. All of this stuff gets rendered by the browser, and that's because somewhere else in the world, a computer sent back a response with all of this information, like the header should be blue and the logo should be white. All of that information was sent back from another computer somewhere else in the world. And that computer that's on the receiving end of those HTTP requests, that computer that sends those responses back to us, those are what we classify as server computers, okay? So they're like any other computer. We could even convert our own laptops and desktops into those kinds of server computers, and we can set up our own laptops to take requests from all over the world if we wanted to. But the thing is, these servers are designed to handle many requests at the same time. Imagine if 500 or 1,000 people were simultaneously trying to use your computer right now and do all kinds of different operations. Your computer would probably crash. But server computers are designed to handle that kind of a load. So that's really the main difference. Now, let's talk about what happens inside of that server computer. We really need to break it down and understand it. And this is where we're going to get pretty granular, okay? So what happens is that inside of that server computer, there's an application that needs to be running, and it's called a web server application, okay? So just like you've got web browsers like Google Chrome and Microsoft Internet Explorer and Mozilla Firefox, these server computers have specific applications on them as well that have been installed by people. And one of those applications is called a web server, okay? And they have different names as well, like WebRick or Unicorn or Apache. Now, what happens is that web server application catches that HTTP request and then communicates with the rest of the computer to figure out exactly how it should respond back to the client, okay, the computer that originally made that request. In terms of Ruby on Rails, here's how it works. If you look at this diagram, this is how a lot of people like to represent a Ruby on Rails app. We call this the MVC architecture, and that stands for Model View Controller. So let's use Twitter as an example. When I go to twitter.com, and hit enter, we get back this home page, right, with all of these buttons and images and logos and text. What happens is our browser sends a request for twitter.com. And remember, that domain name just translates to some numerical address, and it searches through the internet until it finds a computer with that exact address. And that computer is what we call the server. And then from there, the server processes the request. Okay, so the first thing that happens is inside the server, there's an application called a web server. That web server looks for a Ruby on Rails application. And the job of that Ruby on Rails application is to come back with all of the right logos and text and buttons, all the right HTML to show the user for the home page. Okay, and the way it does that is it looks at a few key files that are inside the Rails application. Okay, so just keep in mind, when I say Ruby, I'm referring to the programming language. And when I say Rails, Rails is not a programming language. Rails is simply just a way of organizing Ruby files in a convenient template format. So if we were using, for example, the PHP programming language, we would use a different framework if we wanted to. We could use Laravel, for example. There's a lot of different frameworks that you can use with each language. And when we say framework, again, all we mean is just a template. It's a way of organizing all of your code. Now, in the case of Ruby here, since we're using the Rails framework, the first thing the web server software does is it catches that request and it communicates with a file called the routes file. Okay, and then that routes file communicates with another file inside of this controllers folder. That controller file takes the lead from there. What it does is it figures out what kind of data we need as well as what kind of HTML we need, and it puts all of that together and sends it right back to the web server. The web server sends it right back to the client, the browser that made the initial request. And that's how we get this Twitter homepage. So let's take a look at that kind of firsthand now. If we look here at our Nitrous box, okay, what we're looking at when we're logged into our Nitrous box is we're staring directly at the internals of a server somewhere, okay? So it could be a server that's near you or it could be many thousands of miles away. Just depends on where Nitrous places their servers across the world. And what Nitrous allows us to do is have direct access to the server. So our job as a web developer is to put the proper Ruby on Rails files in there. And what we want that Ruby on Rails application to do is to produce the right HTML to send back to our users whenever they come to our sites. This will make more sense down the line if it's kind of hard to grasp right now, but just follow along. Okay, so what I can do from here is we can look at our blog app. So I can type cd workspace here and then /blog to get into that directory. Again, we're staring directly at the server here, and so we have this Rails application that we generated and we put it on the hard drive of this Nitrous server. And now what we need to do next to make our website go live, we have to start up this application that's on the Nitrous computer, that Nitrous server, and that application is called a web server. And this particular web server has a name, it's called Webrick. And the way we start it up is we just type bundle exec Rails server. So we did this already before. And the reason why that's a very important step is this is what brings our application to life. Now, what we can do is click on this convenient preview tab here and click port 3000. And from here, we have this unique address. Yours is going to look a little bit different from mine. And from any computer in the world, we can put this address in a browser, and when we click enter, we'll get back this home page, right? So it automatically came up when we clicked on that preview tab for us. Now, what's happening here is what we kind of spelled out earlier, okay? So whenever anyone goes to this address from anywhere in the world, that entire process takes place in an instant. So the same thing happens when you go to google.com or facebook.com. A process occurs when you go there. So that's what's happening here. We're going to this address and a certain process is taking place on this Nitrous computer. The first thing that happens is this Webrick application that's running communicates with certain files on this Nitrous hard drive. Now you'll notice this Webrick web server doesn't have a fancy user interface like a web browser would or a Microsoft Word processor would. Instead, it's just a bunch of text laid out here inside of this terminal window. But the thing is, that's really all we need it to do. We don't need anything more fancy than that. So since we ran this special command here, this web server application is running right now, as we can see. And what it's doing is it's accepting requests. So when anyone goes to this URL here, an HTTP request that looks like this gets sent out to this particular address. And this address just gets converted into a numerical address. And what happens is that request goes and finds a computer somewhere out in the world that matches that address. And that would be our Nitrous server, our Nitrous box. So what happens is when that request comes in, Webrick, since it's running, it catches that HTTP request and then it processes it. The first thing that Webrick does is it looks for a file called the routes file. The routes file is always located right here inside this configuration folder, right there where it says routes. The code in this file then gets executed. And since in this case we want to go to the home page of this website, since we don't have any trailing slashes here, we just have the .com, the address itself, we just want the home page. So from here, the routes file runs some code, and in particular, it runs this line of code here. And what this line of code is saying is find a controller file that's called posts and look for a line of code that is called index. And that particular controller file in a Rails application is always located right here inside this app directory. And right there under the controllers folder, you'll see a set of controller files. And the one we're interested in is called the post controller, since we specified post here in the routes file. So then this file gets executed. These particular lines right here get executed. And what Rails does is it says, looking at this diagram, we need to now go and gather resources from this model file as well as HTML stuff from the appropriate view file. And so the model file is located right here. And there's that post model file. And then the appropriate view file is determined by this name right here, index. So it looks inside this posts folder here, and it finds a file called index.html. You might have other files here called index, but it wants the one that's called HTML by default. So what the controller does is gathers all the code from this index file here. This is the HTML, so this is kind of the look of the application. And it also gathers any information from this model file. And what this does is pulls information from the database that's stored on the actual Nitrous server. And then the controller takes all of that information and sends it right back to Webrick, the web server application that's running. And finally, Webrick sends all of that right back to the browser that made the request. In this case, it's this browser tab right here. That's kind of a step-by-step of what's happening. I know I introduced a lot of different terminology to you if you're new to this kind of stuff. Try not to feel too overwhelmed. We're going to break all of this down step by step down the line, and you'll get a good grasp of this over time.